Hi there, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're here for this orientation webinar for ECW's new open call for proposals focused on that intersection of climate and education in emergencies and protracted crises. Now everyone, we have had a lot of interest in the webinar. Over 200 people have registered, so we might just give them one more minute just to log in and join us before we get started. So thank you for your patience. We'll get started in a minute or two. Okay, colleagues, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. I see people are they're still logging on and joining, which is great. But let's get started. I know you're joining us from all around the world, different time zones, so I want to be mindful of that. And we have an hour together, so let's make the most of it. Thank you so much for joining. As I said, this is an orientation webinar for a new opportunity from Education Cannot Wait. It's a new open call for proposals focused on the intersection of climate and education in emergencies and protracted crises. Before we get started, just a few bits of admin from my side. We are using the Zoom webinar function today, and that means you won't be able to take yourselves off mute as you would in a normal meeting. But we do want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. So please do make use of the Q&A box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button that you can press. And using that, you'll be able to submit your questions. And we are reserving 30 minutes of this call, the final 30 minutes for that Q&A, where we hope to address as many of your questions as possible. So please do put your questions there. If you are struggling with that at all, feel free to also use the chat. We'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A function. We're sorry we don't have time to introduce everybody today, but it is great to see so many of you on the call, and we're delighted to see the interest in this topic. I think it really demonstrates just how important this is for the education and emergencies community. So without further ado, we're 3 minutes over. I suggest we get started. Just to introduce the colleagues helping us today, I just wanted to give a huge thank you to Barnvi and Noria, who are working away behind the scenes, two brilliant interns supporting this work. And also to my colleague Mumu, who's kindly helping us with all things related to Zoom. It's a real team effort. But what I'd really like to do is to hand over to the Chief of Strategy Planning and Accountability here at ECW, who leads our work on climate and the acceleration facility. And she's going to begin the presentation for us today. So I'll be handing over to Raki. Just a reminder to keep your questions coming, and we look forward to responding to them soon. Over to you, Raki. Thank you very much, everyone.
Super, thanks Charlotte, and really lovely to be in community with so many of you today. Thanks. I just want to add my thanks also for the huge interest in this proposal. It's really heartwarming that the global community are interested in this intersection. So today I'm going to start and then hand over to Charlotte later in the presentation. What I want to do is really give a brief introduction to Education Cannot Wait, our strategic approach to climate, and then our strategic approach to the acceleration facility. We'll then dive in really for the heart of the presentation into this call for proposals and the detail in the terms of reference. So that's the agenda for today, as you can see on the screen. So really kicking off just to provide some background on Education Cannot Wait. So we're the global fund for education in emergencies and protracted crises, EiEPC. We're an independent fund within the UN system. So we're hosted by UNICEF, but we're independent from UNICEF with our own governance mechanisms. We were formed in 2016, really when the world effectively woke up to the fact we were failing children in the most crisis-affected settings in terms of educational access, and really failing effectively on SDG 4 in those settings. So we were set up with huge support from donors across public and private sector. And to date, we've raised, over 1.6 billion, reached almost 10 million children, in over 40 countries. And the types of population groups we support are refugee children, internally displaced children, children affected by sudden and slow onset climate shocks, children living in conflict. So I wanted to first start on our climate commitment. So we have a current strategic plan that's a 4-year strategic plan, 2023 to 2026. And in it aims to reach 20 million children. But also within it, there are a number of programmatic priorities, and climate is a big, bold priority that we've put in the strategic plan actually for the first time. And the 7 commitments we've made on climate are here on the screen, and they really fall across a few areas: programming, policy, and operational. So we've tried to be quite holistic and intentional in the way we're thinking about climate. And I'll just flag a few things. So on programming, I just want to highlight the role of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, which is really a guiding star for our work. We formally endorsed it. We're now a partner of GADRES, as well as a number of other networks. But we try to use, sector-specific best practice frameworks to guide our work. And then you can see there's a specific point there on the acceleration facility. So that's a commitment that we've made to allocate funding to make a contribution to global learning, research, guidance on climate. So we're delighted to finally be launching this climate call for proposals to really honour and deliver on that commitment that we've made. So the next slide has 3 documents, and they're really, I would say, the building blocks of Education Cannot Wait's climate approach, in addition to the strategic plan. So the first one on the left, the blue one, is our global estimate. So we've become known for producing global estimates each year. And what we have found, very tragically, is that 224 million crisis-affected children and adolescents are in urgent need of educational support. 224 million, therefore, is the figure of children in need that we need as a global community to respond to. And of that figure, 70 million are completely out of school, and around 120 are in school, but not meeting basic minimum proficiencies on SDG 4. So not able to do basic literacy or numeracy. So that's a very, very sad reality that we're working against. And we do a lot of advocacy. We have a 222 million Dreams campaign. That was the original number. It's been growing steadily. So what happened is that we had that global estimate, and the chair of our board, the UN Special Envoy for Education, Gordon Brown, he said, yes, we have this number, but how many of those children and adolescents are climate affected? So last year, we did further workings, and we released a new climate estimate, which is that middle document. So 67 million children living in crisis-affected contexts have had their education disrupted by climate shocks, with around 13 million displacements since 2020. And that figure we use to then do climate-specific advocacy and fundraising at COP in Dubai last year, COP28. So we launched an appeal, which is the far right document called Right Here, Right Now, really trying to raise global awareness about the very unique needs of children in these types of contexts who are climate affected, and whose access to education, whose right to education needs to be safeguarded. And we were delighted to receive our first contribution at COP, announced by Denmark. It was $7 million. So that was a really positive start. And I think just on as an aside on COP, it was interesting. to be in Dubai and actually see through, for example, the Declaration on Conflict Relief, Recovery and Peace, how that was launched, and how different global funds are now really trying to make a steadfast commitment to do more in fragile and conflict-affected states. I think what we're seeing is this new urgency and new energy globally around the intersection of climate and conflict. And it's, you know, it's an intersection in which we absolutely work, given the context in which we work. And what we're trying to do is raise awareness of education within that climate conflict intersection. So the next slide gives you a sense of our funding window. So I'll start with our first emergency response. We have three types of funding windows, three types of investment windows. So the first is what we call the FER, F-E-R. So they're 12-month programs where we go in within days, weeks of a crisis to safeguard access to quality education. So very much on the humanitarian side of the humanitarian development spectrum. And in terms of climate examples, we used a FER, for example, to respond to Pakistan floods, to spikes in drought in Somalia. When Cyclone Idai hit, that was, we used a FER to respond to that. It was a multi-country FER in that case. What's new this year is that we're now trying to do work to act ahead of when a disaster hits. And actually at COP, we signed up to the Getting Ahead of Disasters framework, committing ourselves to put financing to act early. So this year we'll be rolling out 2 anticipatory action pilots that will be very purely anticipatory action to safeguard education ahead of anticipated climate shock. And we'll be doing that in 2 contexts to be announced later this year. So our second window is our multi-year resilience program window, our MYRPs, which we also call MERPs. So they're 3-year projects that really work more on the humanitarian development spectrum. They're effectively, within climate terms, adaptation programs. And within MERPs right now, there are a few changes. So we're now asking all partners to do climate and environment assessments before they receive funding, both to understand how climate and environment affects their programming, but also to understand their own impact as responsible grantees of ECW on the environment. We're also using the OECD DAC Rio markers to now rigorously tag our climate programming so we can actually get a sense of our climate footprint. And what we know, actually, we've done some rough mapping so far. Even before climate was a big strategic priority of ECW, we allocated some 40 million in climate FERs, and we had across our MERPs, at least 25% of them were doing DRR. So that was without us really even intentionally working on climate. And now we are, and we have new climate guidance that we're using when we design our multi-year programs. We're actually going to, I think we're going to see a lot more climate sensitivity across those programs and aligned to the CSSF. And then finally, our final investment window, which is a window that I lead on, and I'm also the institutional lead for ECW on climate, is our acceleration facility. So this is, in a simplistic way, I would call it an innovation fund. It's 40 million over the lifetime of this strategic plan. And it's really about funding, the next generation of global goods, global research for our sector, the EiEPC sector. And I'll speak more about the acceleration facility in a moment, but you can see that what's new this year is our climate work through the AF. We've never run a call for proposals on climate before. We've never funded, more climate sensitive organizations before through the AF. So this is an exciting new change for us. The next slide is a picture of Adenike, who's well, on World Environment Day last month, we were delighted to announce Adenike as our first ever climate champion. And I think this really speaks to potentially advocacy, which I think runs in ECW's blood. As well as doing our programming and policy change, we try to be very loud globally on advocacy platforms in social media, but also big news outlets. And having Adenike on board allows us to now raise even greater awareness on climate. She was she's no longer theoretically a youth, but she was a huge youth climate advocate in Nigeria, where she's still based, and she created the Friday for Futures movement, and she's specifically interested in the impact of climate change on the Lake Chad Basin, and we do a lot of programming in that area. So it's a really positive fit, and actually the wording she uses, as you can see, is from our appeal, our climate appeal that we launched right here, right now. And just a word on why we chose that title. I think what we are seeing is when people talk about climate and education within, you know, key climate policy spaces, there's often a focus on green curriculums or climate education or empowering young people as agents of change, all of which undoubtedly are important. But what we're finding is that within that dialogue, actually the needs of climate affected young people, children living at the front line of the climate crisis right now, who tomorrow can't go to school because of a flood risk, they're almost being overlooked within that big focus on green curriculums and climate ed. So, you know, right here, right now, it's about children at the front line of the climate crisis right here, right now, and the need to respond, you know, urgently. So I'll now dive into the acceleration facility. So as I said, it's about global change within the sector, global learning, global goods, $40 million that we're allocating over 4 years. And to date, we've allocated, last year, we started by allocating 8 million. So we have 3 sub-windows within the AF. One is what we call our architecture partners, global actors working in the sector. The second window is our thematic window. So we have about 7 themes that we fund against. They include gender, disability, data and evidence, political will, and climate is now one of those themes. And the third window is smaller scale, and it includes, it's called our innovation window, and it's really about smaller, innovative ventures or potentially specific major events that would have big policy value add. And just to note that the current design of our acceleration facility is informed by an organizational evaluation that was done on ECW about 2 years ago. And what that meant is that we made changes to the AF. So it's now about more competitive grants, there's more multi-year grants, more strategic grants, and more cross-fertilization between our acceleration facility, our AF window, and those FERS and MERPs that I talked about earlier, especially the MYRPs, our multi-year programs, because they run for longer. The following slide just gives you a sense of some of the current partners that we're funding under the AF. So the top row includes some of our architecture partners, so the Global Education Cluster, EiEPC, the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, GCPA. So, you know, big players globally who are constantly producing global goods and delivering on global coordination. And then we have our thematic window that includes, for example, Plan and Voice, who are some of the grantees for our gender grant, and IDA for our grant that's focused on disability inclusion. And then examples of our grantees on, you know, innovation include Warchild, for example, who we funded to help deliver the Nordic Conference on Mental Health and Psychosocial Support, which is one of our programmatic priorities. And for the Climate Acceleration Facility grant this year, there's actually 2 types of grants that we're finalizing. This thematic one, which is done competitively, but we're also going to be finalizing 1 to 2 new climate architecture partners who are in the process of selecting. And actually, I think once all of our partners are in place on climate, we absolutely would want to put them in touch and have that cross-fertilization. So we're now going to zone into this particular call for proposals that I'm sure you're very keen to hear more about. So I'm handing over to Charlotte to provide you with the details on that.
Many thanks, Raki, and hi again, everybody. Yes, we're hoping you're all here because you are interested in applying for this opportunity. As I said, this is an open call for proposals, really looking at that intersection of climate and education in emergencies and protracted crises. And if we just go to the next slide, I just sort of give some sort of general things to consider. So first of all, just to note that the total value for this open call for proposals is 2.4 million, but this funding is spread across 3 objectives. And many of you may have seen that terms of reference already, and that there are 3 very distinct objectives in the RFP, and we have given indicative funding amounts for each objective. So it's one RFP, but with 3 objectives or work streams, if you like. So your expressions of interest that you will hopefully submit will hopefully address one of those objectives. They are very distinct in nature. We'll look at those very soon. And they will have a very specific criteria. We're looking for something quite distinct for each of those 3 objectives. So because of that, we are sort of assuming that we will be developing 3 different partnerships, 1 for each objective. And that's because they are quite different, and we are anticipating that, you know, different organizations have different expertise and skill sets, and they're likely to focus on one objective. But I would note that, you know, some organizations may feel they can speak to several of those objectives, in which case you can apply for more than 1, but you would need to do a different expression of interest for each one because they have these distinct criteria. And just a reminder that we are anticipating these partnerships running for 3 years, but there is some flexibility there. It will very much depend on the nature of your proposal, and we can go up to 5 years. So just keeping that in mind. And one of the things we recognise is that having some multi-year funding allows for greater impact. So that's what we're trying to do here. And then a few other sort of general considerations for you as you're working up your expressions of interest. The first one is, as Raki mentioned when she was speaking to the role of the acceleration facility for ECW, we want you to be ambitious and innovative here. The acceleration facility really allows us to advance sort of more innovative work for the sector. So please do sort of embrace that in your applications. Secondly, in the expression of interest, I think it's important to demonstrate that you and your organization have really sort of the specific knowledge and experience needed for that objective. We really want to see that evidence. So it's not just about having exciting ideas for the activities and the outcomes, so that's very important, but it's also demonstrating that the partnership between ECW and yourself will bring real value add through that expertise. Another point here that I think is very important is that ECW's mandate and focus is very much around education in emergencies and protracted crises. So while we know that the sort of broader sector around climate and education, more broadly speaking, is hugely important, and there's a very exciting work happening there, this call for proposals is really focused on those emergency protracted crises contexts. And because of that, we are requesting any work at the country level carried out through these RFPs aligns with the countries that ECW focuses on, where our country programmes are. And that list can be found in the terms of reference, and we'll also share it in the slides. So just a reminder about that focus on education in emergencies and protracted crises and the specific countries where ECW works. And then lastly here, just a reminder again that, as Raki said, ECW funds country programmes through our first emergency response and through our MERPs. The acceleration facility is really more thinking about the sector and global goods for the sector. So even if your proposal is focused on something small scale at the country level, we'd like you to think about how that can still be a global good. So what are the learnings from that? What's the evidence? Maybe you're developing a model that can be shared more broadly, or resources that can be shared publicly. But all of this work should really thinking about how it can help the sector to advance. So this idea of global goods. And I think there's one more point on this slide. I won't go into too much detail here, but I do just want to mention that Education Cannot Wait is a global fund hosted by UNICEF. And so we follow all of UNICEF's protocols and processes. So were you to be successful in your application, which hopefully several of you will be, just to note that there are various assessment processes that you need to go through before funds can be dispersed. You may be familiar with them, the HACT assessment and the PSEA assessment, for example. Some of you may have already gone through these assessments, in which case that would be very quick. If you haven't, it can take longer. So just something to bear in mind, that the start date for this partnership may depend on the length of time for those assessment processes. So please do just keep that in mind. But that's something to think about later in the process, where we're sort of at the selection process. Great, so let's have a look. What is it we're looking for in this open call for proposals? There are, as I said, 3 very distinct objectives. The first one here with the tree symbol is focused on temporary learning spaces. And as you see, it says here, it's around developing guidance to support the development of environmentally friendly temporary learning spaces, or TLS, as you may know them as. And this is really, through our analysis at ECW, we recognise that a lot of progress has been made in the formal education systems around greening education infrastructure. But actually, when it comes to the temporary learning spaces that are so fundamental to many emergency responses, actually we haven't yet made the same progress. And there's a real gap here that colleagues in the sector are really looking for more guidance here about how to do temporary learning spaces in a more environmentally friendly way. And we want to address this gap for the sector. So this first objective would really ask you to look at good practice, including in ECW programming around environmentally friendly temporary learning spaces, do some costings of TLSs and thinking about contextual factors for TLSs, and then use that to really build out global guidance, maybe that's principles or standards or tools, and to test those again in ECW contexts. And one thing I think to note as well is we're also keen that this isn't just sort of some guidance that sits on a shelf, but that it's meaningful and useful. And so you'll see in the terms of reference that it's also about kind of how we disseminate that and build capacity on that global guidance. And so we're really encouraging partners who apply for this objective to think about how they might collaborate with the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, or the Global Education Cluster, or others actors in the sectors who can help support, disseminate, institutionalize this type of global guidance, as we're hoping it will be something that's really useful and meaningful for the sector as a whole. As you can see, we've given some indicative funding ceiling for this objective. So we are expecting your expressions of interest if you're applying for this objective to be up to 750,000 USD. And obviously that will depend on the nature of your proposal. And if you're successful, there may be some discussions about that, the final amounts. So the second objective is then quite different, and this is really focused on loss and damage. And as you may be aware, there are a lot of emerging opportunities around loss and damage at the moment, but there's a real risk of education in emergencies and protracted crises specifically being overlooked and not part of those conversations. So we really want to address this gap around sort of evidence, policy and financing around loss and damage. So we're looking for a partner or partners who can undertake some research, build the evidence on loss and damage, and then conduct really concrete advocacy using that evidence to advocate for EiEPC. And we're hoping that the proposal here, the partner here, will be very familiar with some of the really important and fast-moving opportunities here to really influence discussions, influence climate decision makers to make sure EiEPC is included as part of these conversations, and ultimately, in the long run, unlock climate finance for EiEPC. So that's the goal here. So for this second one, it might be that some partners want to come together, as research and advocacy may require different skills. So you may want to partner for this one. And I think we'll also want to see that real knowledge of the climate sector, because whereas the first objective is very much speaking to the education sector around global guidance, this second one is actually less about influencing the education sector and more about influencing the climate sector and really elevating EiEPC in those forums and influencing those processes. You'll see that there's a higher funding ceiling for this piece of work, up to 1.2 million USD. And then the third is different again, and this is actually quite a broad, open objective, and I think we're quite excited for what might come into this one, and it may be of interest to many of you on the call in different contexts, because what we're looking for here is I think we really recognise, again from our analysis, that there is a lot of really important and exciting work happening in local communities to address this challenge around climate and the EiEPC. And here at ECW, we really want to support that. So we're looking at sort of scaling up any effective models for sort of locally driven innovative solutions in climate smart education programming. So that could be anything, right? That could be around gender programming. It could be looking at teacher support. It might be around MHPSS. So many different ways of looking at this. And it might be, an initiative in a very specific context that you're working on and you're looking to expand. or maybe it's a network working in a few different contexts with local organisations wanting to support different work happening. I think the expressions of interest here will be quite varied, and that's good. We really want to sort of be led by the great work that's happening, rather than for us to sort of put too many parameters on what this could look like. And it may be that we end up with more than one partnership here, depending on the applications. But you'll see again a ceiling here of 750,000. And the amount will, of course, vary depending on the proposal that you put forward. You'll note that these don't add up to the total of 2.4 that I put, and that's because we just recognise that these are going to really vary depending on the nature of your proposals. So we're just creating some flexibility so that we can, have the right amounts for the right proposals. What I'll do now, everyone, I'm conscious you have likely already seen the terms of reference on the website, but just in case you haven't, we're just going to put up a bit more information, and I'll stop talking just so you can have a quick look. And also you may want to be thinking about the questions you have. So this is about the first objective. So we'll just leave that slide up for 30 seconds just so you can have a bit more of a look, a bit more of the detail. I'll put the link in the chat as well. Okay, Banvi, let's move to the next slide. This is objective 2, just with a bit more detail for you there. Great, thanks, Banvi. And then the third one here. Okay, great. Thank you, Banvi. And I can see questions coming in, which is great. We will turn to these shortly. I know we need to protect our time. So just one last thing before I hand back to Raki. And actually several of the questions are about the focus countries. So this is the list of contexts that are focus countries for this work. And this comes from analysis again by our education team about contexts which are priority countries for Education Cannot Wait, where we have existing country-focused programming. And there are also countries that we feel are particularly significant, relevant when it comes to the climate crisis. And they've done that sort of analysis of that intersection. So any work set out in your proposals that's at the country level should be focused on these countries. Obviously not all of these countries, but some countries from this list. I would say that if you are successful, the next round of the sort of final full proposal, we at that point would be wanting you to connect with ECW's in-country partners and to explore opportunities for collaboration there. We find that can be very impactful for our acceleration facility work to have those connections with on our country investments. But that would happen at a later stage. And we also recognise that because these are very much evolving contexts, as we move through the final proposal process, we may need to have some discussions about, is it the right context for the proposal? Is it the right, has the situation changed? May we need to consider different contexts? So there will be some discussion as we move through the final selection of grantees and final proposals, but we would ask you to focus your proposals on one or more of the countries in this list. Great. Okay. So I think that's hopefully given you an overview, a flavour of the terms of reference. I've put the link in the chat so you can find more information there. And just to say, we are going to be adding to that web link an FAQ document, which will update with your questions from today and any other questions that we receive, and we'll keep that regularly updated. So you will be able to continue to find more information out there. But I'll hand over to Raki, I think, for the final few slides before we go to the Q&A. Oh, you're just on mute, Raki.
Apologies, thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. So this slide is really to update on, or just to refresh everyone's memory on what the application process looks like. There are 2 stages. We're at stage 1. So at this point, all we're asking for is an expression of interest, which is the technical proposal, and a separate document, which is the financial proposal. So the technical proposal is in Word and the financial proposal is in Excel, but we're asking you to submit them as PDFs in one email. And if you want to apply to more than one theme, you need to submit a separate proposal, as Charlotte has said already. So you would need to send different emails. After stage 1, applications are submitted, we will then have a review and we will invite some applicants to move to stage 2, at which we'll be asked to provide more documents. So a more worked up technical proposal. At that point, we'd also be asking for a results framework, a revised budget template, and we'd probably at that point also maybe ask you to, if needed, to adjust your budget to a specific an amount. And at that point, we'll also be asking for a risk assessment. So stage 2 is a lot more comprehensive, but we're trying to make stage 1 light touch to really encourage accessibility and a wide spread of applicants. And then the next slide really just gives an indicative timeline that we very much want to try our best to work to. So the deadline for the current stage 1 expression of interest is August the 5th. And I think we've given at least a month for this stage 1, and that was actually based on previous feedback that, you know, partners are really keen to try and get as much time as possible to be able to work up grants. We hope you feel that you've got enough time to do that. I know often it involves a lot of internal coordination. We will look at those across August, and we intend to notify applicants of the result by the end of August. And at that point, if you're successfully invited to submit to stage 2, you'd be then also invited, and you'd be submitting your proposals by the end of September. So you'd have approximately another month to work up your stage 2 proposals. And then there would be a few months, and we'd be looking to launch this at COP. I think what is also not necessarily here is actually what happens after stage 2 proposals are submitted. And I think that's a question we can turn to in the Q&A. Will all stage 2 proposals be funded? We will I think answer in the Q&A further. I will move to the next slide, which I believe is the last slide. Thank you for bearing with us with our presentation. I think we're now going to very much turn to the Q&A, and we've been answering some questions already. So you can see some questions that have been answered, and then we've also been collating some of the other questions under theme. So I'm going to hand back to Charlotte to run this.
Thanks, Raki, and thanks everyone. And I still see questions coming in. Do keep them coming. If we run out of time today, as I mentioned before, we are going to keep a live Q&A document on the website, so we'll add them there and make sure we answer your questions. We've had a couple of questions around this assessment point that I mentioned. So Raki, maybe you could just reassure colleagues around the HACT assessment requirements.
Absolutely. So we wanted to make sure it's as level a playing field as possible for applicants. You do not need to be HACT assessed in order to apply at stage 1. So you can apply never having been HACT assessed. And, if you are successful down the line, we will naturally need to HACT assess you. So I think the only thing to bear in mind is that if you apply, you just need to apply knowing that in order to successfully receive funding, should it come to that, you would need to pass your HACT assessment. And that process can be lengthy. So that also can affect project timelines in terms of start dates, but it's not a requirement, and you can apply not having been HACT assessed. If you have been HACT assessed, I mean, feel free to put it down, but it's not necessarily a scoring criteria, because again, we want to make sure that we're leveling the playing field, so organizations who haven't necessarily been funded already by the UN still have a good chance of being considered thoughtfully.
Thanks, Raki. Yeah, hopefully that reassures colleagues around the assessment piece. The next question is around the number of proposals per organisation. Can organisations be part of more than one application? So Raki, again, do you want to address that?
Sure, this is a great question, and actually it's one that we haven't yet formulated an answer to. So if you're an organisation that is interested in more than one theme, you are absolutely allowed to submit a proposal against theme 1, theme 2, and theme 3. We don't expect that organizations will be wonderfully suited to deliver on all 3. It would have to be quite a standout organization, I feel. But you're very welcome to express interest and submit against more than one theme. If you want to submit more than one proposal against an individual theme, say on the innovative programming theme, number 3, you'd like to submit more than one proposal with different types of options, then that is something that we need to decide and discuss internally. And actually, I promise that we will update the FAQ. I think we'll make a decision on that by Friday. So on Friday, at some point, we will update the FAQ document and actually put a number to that. I don't have an instinctive answer yet, so let me consider that further. And on Friday, we'll update to say whether you're permitted to submit more than one proposal per theme.
Thanks, Raki. Raki, just a quick follow on. We just had a question about whether ECW would encourage or accept consortium applications. Do you just want to respond?
Absolutely. We really warmly encourage consortium applications. And I think we've even put that in the RFP under some specific themes. So I think theme 3, I think the wording also specifically says we warmly encourage consortiums. Theme 2, it says very much a real sense of having to work in partnership with climate and EiEPC actors. That could absolutely be done in consortium. I think we would warmly and I wouldn't necessarily say favorably, because it depends on the nature of the consortium and the players, but I think definitely where consortiums can add value, we would absolutely want to see that come into the proposal. And I would see it as a positive if the right selection of actors come on board. So 100%, please do consider pursuing a consortium, obviously with a clear lead who's the main consortium lead, under which the grant would be dispersed.
Thanks, Raki. Just a quick response from me. Somebody has asked if CSOs can apply. A lot of questions about different types of applications. Can academic institutions apply? Yes, we encourage applications from CSOs, from academic institutions. Everyone is encouraged to apply, and more detail is in the TOR about the specifics. But yeah, we would certainly encourage you to apply. Raki, we're getting a lot of questions here around the countries. About countries being included or not included. Can people apply for multiple country contexts? Lots of questions around the countries. I just wondered if you wanted to respond to that. I'm also happy to jump in. Sure.
So we gave this a lot of thought before launching the RFP, and also based on our learning of how we've run other acceleration facility grants. And what we found at ECW, particularly because we want to better marry our AF work and our FERS and our multi-year programs, is that we want to have a similar set of countries across all of them. So in the presentation, Charlotte had a slide on countries. In the details online about the RFP, there's also a list of those countries that you can refer to. And what we're saying, and this is effectively a red line, is that, for example, for the innovative programming, you would have to be delivering work in one of those countries. The way that ECW works is that we have a specific modality. We focus on crisis-affected countries. We actually use an index that's a composite index to decide which countries we work in. It's based on a range of factors, including the informed severity index. But to cut to the chase, we have a set number and a type of country that we work in, and we would absolutely want these programs to be aligned with it. So you would need to be submitting a proposal that works in at least one of those countries if the proposal has a country-facing element. So that particularly applies to the program theme 3, which is innovative programming, and also theme 1, which has an element of testing the model, right, and the guidance. Theme 2 is really about global loss and damage. So I think naturally, if you're thinking about sort of global trends, it would have to be, looking obviously globally and may involve a larger subset of countries. But if there are specific countries that you're zoning in on, then again, we would want it to be one of those countries in that list. So I hope that's clear. I appreciate that. That's disappointing for some organizations who might have a specific country focus, but we've had to come to that decision really to make sure that this grant is the best strategic fit for how ECW operates, and also because of an independent organization evaluation that was done on ECW that told us to better align our AF work to our other programs. And the final point is on number of countries. It doesn't have to be a multi-country bid unless the theme expressly says that. For the innovative programming theme, for example, you could just submit a bid specific to one country, but you're obviously entitled to do more than one country, but that will be, based on your decision as an organization in terms of, programmatic budget, etc., and spread and results, whether it's better to go many countries and maybe less detailed programming. It's really your decision as to what you decide to submit, but it can be just one country. That's perfectly allowed. I believe the wording though in the first theme, we can double check that and we can also confirm this in the FAQs. I believe it says that it would need to be tested in more than one country, but Charlotte, if you remember that, please you're nodding yes. So I think theme 1, it would have to be tested. So this is about the greening temporary learning spaces. You couldn't apply for that theme and only be focusing on one country. It would need to be more in line with the terms of reference.
Thanks, Raki, and thanks again, everyone, for these brilliant questions. Seeing a couple more that perhaps just to give quick reassurance to. One is asking if sort of local organisations are eligible to apply, and again, we really encourage as diverse a pool of applicants as possible. Please do feel welcome and encouraged to apply for this opportunity. And another colleague asking if you're already involved at the country level in MERPs and FERS, are you able to apply? And again, yes, there isn't a restriction if you're already working at the country level. That won't prohibit you from applying for our acceleration facility grants. So yeah, just an encouragement there for colleagues asking if they're eligible. All of the requests I've seen so far, you would be eligible to apply. Of course, recognising that there's assessment steps later down the line that Raki already set out. Raki, we've had an interesting question here around whether ECW could sort of match people up who may bring different skills and would be able to partner together. This isn't something we've set out in the TOR. My instinct is that we perhaps don't have the capacity on this sort of front end to forge those partnerships before you submit expressions of interest. Although perhaps when we're in the review process, we might be able to identify opportunities where we think some applicants could join forces. What's your sense on that, Raki?
Absolutely. I think we won't be matching anyone up prior to stage 1, but it could be that having reviewed stage 1 proposals, if, for example, on the loss and damage theme, there's actually two proposals that have a real complementarity, we might, in terms of asking, moving to stage 2, say to those two organizations, we're very interested in both your proposals, and actually what we'd like to do is invite you to pair up and submit a stage 2 proposal if you're willing to do so. So absolutely, I think after stage 1, we may decide to pair organizations up if we see that there's real complementarity in doing that, but we're not actively pairing anyone up before stage 1. I also saw there was an interesting question in the chat about, is there a list for organizations to pair up with each other? Unfortunately, we don't have that, but we'll see whether maybe that's something that we could potentially facilitate, or we'll need to see what's possible there. And also with data protection and etc., it might be difficult for us to host that, but it's a really interesting idea. How do organizations reach out to each other and understand who's on the who's also interested in this grant?
Thanks, Rocky, and yeah, thanks for the great idea, and perhaps someday. I'm just going to quickly respond to some questions around the financing levels. There's a question about whether the 2.4 overall budget is for one objective or for multiple. Just to again reiterate that that's the total, and that will be spread across the 3 objectives. And also a question about whether you can apply for less than the indicative amounts that we provided. And yes, of course, what we hope that you would apply for the amount that makes sense for your initiative. Yeah, please feel free. Those are indicative and more of a ceiling actually, but please feel free to apply for a lower amount if that is what makes sense for you, your organization, and your initiative. Rocky, an interesting question about a lot of work in the sector around DRR, disaster risk resilience. I hope I'm getting that right. I just wondered if you want to speak to that at all in terms of ECW's wider work around climate and the connections we see there. I mean, my sense is that while theme 1 and 2 are quite specific in what we're looking for, theme 3 is again very open, and so we'd encourage you to think of that in a broader sense. But anything else on DRR and the connection to that, Rocky?
Sure. So it's an interesting question. Definitely, our work includes DR, and as I said earlier, when we did a rough mapping of this, 25% of all our programs to date have a DR component across, those are programs across Latin America, Asia, Africa. So it's definitely being holistically included in our work. I don't believe it's, in this call for proposals, we haven't explicitly said that we're looking for DR style initiatives. So for example, for the innovative programming theme, naturally you would be, if you have an innovative idea that's related to DR, you're very welcome to submit it, but it doesn't have to be necessarily incorporate DR at all. I think we've given the example of climate, the intersection of climate education and climate action and mental health and psychosocial support. And I could see a program doing that didn't necessarily have a DR component. So it's absolutely not mandatory to have DR considered, as a quality in your proposal. But if you feel that it makes sense and you've got a great idea, then absolutely you could frame your entire proposal around DR. We've been quite broad, especially on theme 3, right? We've given you a few ideas, but we're expecting a really big range of innovative ideas that work at the intersection of education, emergencies, and climate. So, feel free to really think big and bold and ambitiously. And we're really excited to see, a variety of things come through, and don't necessarily be, what's the word? Don't feel framed in by existing frameworks or existing approaches. If you've got something that's very different, absolutely feel free to submit it. I mean, whilst I talked about things like the CSSF in terms of our own programming and how we deliver MYRPs, we're really interested in different types of approaches, maybe borrowing from completely different sectors. So don't feel that it has to absolutely align with kind of the traditional frameworks out there. Feel free to be innovative and, beyond those.
Thanks, Rocky. Yeah, it really speaks to this this point in the presentation around the AF being around being ambitious and innovative. So please do feel that as you're working up these expressions of interest. Rock, you've had a couple of questions around sort of how the successful grantees will be decided, and perhaps a little bit of confusion with ECW's processes at the country level through the MERPs and the FIRs. So yeah, maybe just a clarifier on how these grantees will be selected.
Sure. So this is a completely different selection process to how we run our first emergency responses and our multi-year resilience programs. Those are decided through a very different process that involves grantee selection committees, often in close coordination with, the relevant coordination structures, for example, the cluster in a given country. This process is completely different to that. We will have a much simpler process. It will be a panel of internal ECW members, and that panel will be looking at the bids, and we will be the deciding factor, and the ultimate selection will go to our executive director and our board because of the levels of financing involved and our governance processes. But it will be an internal ECW panel. We may decide to bring on one or more external experts if we are satisfied that there's zero conflict of interest in that external expert being part of the panel, and there's no conflict with any of the organizations that have applied. So it's a very different process, and that also means that we can, as you saw from the timelines, work a bit quicker. We can receive the proposals at the beginning of August, and hopefully by the end of August tell you whether you've moved to stage 2 or not. I hope that's clear enough.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rocky. And a few sort of relevant to that, a couple of people asking about the role of the cluster and working groups. Again, I think that's because they're obviously so involved in the way we work through our country investments. But just to say that the cluster, the Global Education Cluster, is an acceleration facility partner of ECW, and we speak with them regularly. So while this process isn't done with them at the country level in the same way, we certainly would want to be, we'll be sharing with them the initiatives that come through this, and we hope to engage with them, as we know this is such an important issue for country clusters as well. Great, and just having a look, I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes. Raki, anything you wanted to address?
Yeah, there's a few questions around theme 2 and what's ECW's expected, pardon me, ECW's expected role and vision for milestones and the balance between research and advocacy. So on theme 2, we thought about how we wanted to structure it, but actually we're very interested in organizations themselves deciding what makes sense. Ultimately, as we've said, the whole ambition of theme 2 is policy change, right? We don't want research to be produced that sits on a shelf or isn't read by the right actors. The whole point of theme 2 is ultimately trying to get more education funding, more loss and damage funding allocated to education and the impacts that the education sector experiences in terms of indirect and direct loss and damages. So to achieve that ambition, we think, and we've sort of, our thinking has been set out in the terms of reference, we need to influence decision makers. And we feel in order to influence decision makers, there's different things that you can do. One is advocacy, and another is advocacy involving new research that really makes the case. What balance goes into that really is up to you, and we would hope and expect that there are organizations out there who have expertise in this and actually really have a good sense of how to achieve that kind of policy change. So you come to us with what your menu of options would be and what you think the right balance would be to achieve that change. I can say very broadly, I think if it's very, very research focused, I don't think that's going to make the biggest difference from my engagement with COPs and policy processes so far. There's a huge amount of documentation out there already. What we need to do is produce the right new evidence, but we really need to find better, different ways of using that evidence to influence the right decision makers. not necessarily produce evidence for the education sector to read about the impact on the education sector, which we, many of us know. We need to be influencing climate decision makers in a different way. The loss and damage board, the water implementation mechanism frameworks, as we've set out in the tour. So there's a real intersection with the nuts and bolts of the climate policy architecture. So that hopefully is giving you a sense of this idea of balance. It's really up to you based on your judgment and expertise. In terms of how we will be involved, I think on theme 2, it probably would be the one where ECW would probably most likely have the most involvement, because it's the theme where we are active already in terms of attending COPs and talking to our executive committee, who are all, many of whom are member states, about how are they approaching loss and damage. We're doing advocacy campaigns. So we would want that organization to be in the lead, precisely because we're doing this call for proposals because we don't have the capacity to run this ourselves. And we would want them to have the vision and really lead on it. But definitely there could be moments when ECW can amplify and take what you've done and take it to COP or run an event, etc. But that shouldn't necessarily be a prerequisite for the bid. The bid should be able to run itself. You're welcome to kind of put markers down for where you think ECW might be useful to come in, but it's not a prerequisite. I hope that's clear. And all of these questions we'll write up a response to in the FAQs document as well.
Thanks, Rocky. And yeah, I just posted a response. Somebody asked for some examples of previous AF grants, so I've just put some in there. There is an important question here around language, and just to say, unfortunately, at this stage, we are only accepting expressions of interest in English. We do recognise that is a limitation, and it's something we're talking about internally. And I think longer term, we will try to be more inclusive in terms of language. So we appreciate you flagging that, and please know that we really do recognise that, and it is something we hope to be able to be more inclusive of in future. So thank you for your patience and understanding of that. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to move forward in including more languages. There are still many questions remaining, but I am conscious we're at the hour and you are joining us, as I said, from all over the world, different time zones, and that your time is very precious. So we will take these, we will work up an FAQ document that will go on the website. We really hope that you will apply. We're really excited to see these expressions of interest come in. If you have remaining questions that you don't feel have been answered today and that haven't been addressed by the document we share, there is an email address available on the website where you can contact us with further questions. So please do feel free to make use of that. But thank you so much for your time today. Raki, any final words from you before we close the webinar today?
Just to say thanks so much for your interest and the many questions, and apologies for not being able to get to all of them, but we will have this FAQs document that we will update as we go along. So if you go on the website, when you go to the FAQs document, you'll be able to see when it was last updated, and we'll find a way of showing which questions and answers are new. So you'll be able to find your answers there. I appreciate there are things we didn't answer today. Thanks so much for your interest. It's really heartwarming, and we're genuinely very excited about seeing the proposals come in.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.